Hey, good morning, Savva. Good to see you again.
All right, good to see you too, Corey. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, and as a number of people who I've had the conversation with know, crowdfunding cures is something I'm extremely passionate about. I think that this was the reason why Web3 was created. Now, that said, before we get into crowdfunding cures and before we get into the NFT drop and what that is and why an NFT and kind of what crowdfunding cures is hoping for, I'd like to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Uh, the disclaimer is some of these topics are a bit dense for somebody coming across them for the first time. So, what Savva, what I'd like you and I and the rest of the people in this room to do is to try to make them as digestible as possible. And if they have questions, I'd like them to be able to reach out and ask. And also to know that it's like drinking from the fire hose. You're not going to get all the water at first, but if any bit of this strikes you as meaningful, to reach out to you, and or for that matter, you can reach out to me even, and pull on that thread a little bit more, because I think it's clearly a beautiful thing. It does take a little bit more time than like a meme coin to kind of understand, why it matters and what it's doing and the problem and the solution. So, Savva, I would really love to talk to people about where crowdfunding cures came from and where you came from. Like, what's your story and how this whole thing came to be?
Yeah, sure. So it kind of came from this was the topic of my thesis. So I did. I'm a commercial and IP legal consultant and patent attorney. And about 8 years ago, my fiance got very sick at the time with Crohn's, and I was quite interested in science. I did a lot of science when I was at uni, but I went and did uh, law instead. And but going online, is sort of a lot of people might have had this experience where you go online, you might have had a loved one that's sick or yourself, and then you try and find, what are some treatments out there. And a lot of the treatments that are out there, and particularly hyped up online, are things like off-patent drugs and diets and supplements and things like that. And there's just not a lot of, when you actually look into the clinical trial data behind a lot of those things, there's not a lot of data. Sometimes those things get lumped into something called alternative medicine, right? And what happens is that basically medicine needs these clinical trials in order for you to convince your doctor or your health insurer to reimburse it. And what I realized is that if there's no business model around producing that clinical trial data, because you can't enforce a monopoly price, you can't charge a really high price using patents for an off-patent drug or for a diet, for a supplement, then there's no business model to produce that clinical trial data. And that's when I set up, I did my thesis on this topic, and we looked at using basically like a prize-like incentive, what we call a medical prize, flexible medical prize, for incentivizing development of these clinical trials as an alternative to patents, specifically for these things which I'd call unmonopolizable therapies. So things like repurposed generic drugs, diets, supplements, lifestyle interventions, psychedelics, things like that. So set up a charity. That was a while ago, 2013. Since then, kind of life took over. I went and did more consulting out of London. And then when COVID happened and everyone just started talking about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and things like that, not endorsing those things, but it sort of brought to the fore this whole issue now that people understand, okay, there's particularly for those drugs, there's been billions and billions of dollars spent on those drugs, and yet we don't have, FDA approval for either of them. So we realized like that there is this market failure, and there's a lot of money getting wasted on clinical trials, small clinical trials. And if there was like a business model, then we could actually move forward. And I'd also been involved in the ICO since the ICO days with advising a few crypto projects. So that's one of the things I do have done. And last year reached out to this project called VitaDAO, which is a DeSci project, decentralized science, and I'm advising them on their IP, part of their legal working group. And the plan is basically, and we've connected since then to Molecule. an organization called PsyDAO, which wants to do decentralized psychedelics and unmonopolizable psychedelics. And yeah, we set up Crowdfunded Cures basically now as a Web3 project. It's an impact DAO. The plan is we've got about sort of 10 volunteers, and there's more or less a couple of people full time. We've got a blockchain, a system architect as well, who's come on board from the refi space. And the idea is to basically launch this as a medical impact DAO, and then ultimately a social enterprise pharma company that basically negotiates with large health insurers to that on the basis that if we do the clinical trials to show that these off-patent drugs work, we'll get a percentage of their cost savings. And the way we can design clinical trials is that because you can do comparative clinical trials from a cheap, say, drug like ketamine to an expensive drug like S-ketamine. There's say $850 for S-ketamine and like $2 for ketamine. Because of those cost differences, you can essentially get the health insurer and say to them, look, pay that cost difference to us, and we'll run the clinical trial and actually pay you money, because it's like you save money from doing the clinical trials. Now, crypto comes into this through, we want to basically bootstrap through the issue of open source pharma NFTs, initially an open psychedelic medicine NFT, to basically raise money to stand in for what would normally be a health insurer, and to prove the model out and to basically de-risk the optimal clinical trial protocol for off-patent drugs, particularly psychedelics for treating depression initially. And yeah, we think this is a good use case for NFTs. I go into other things as well, like IP-NFTs for investors, and these things called Hypercerts, which are basically impact certificates, but it depends how much you guys want to get into the weeds. But that's kind of a general background and overview. Even that's probably going to be quite a lot for folks. But yeah, totally happy to go into any questions and things.
Well, Savva, I did notice, I believe it was Protocol DAO, that you had a fantastic slide presentation pulled together for. I didn't know if you were in a position where you can do a slide again. If not, we can talk through it, as you know. But I would really love to be able to kind of go through that, because I think it helps visualize things if you have it. And also, too, I'd love to pull up some of Michael's artwork as well, because I think that could get people excited about the upcoming NFT drop. So that said, do you have the capacity to be able to pull up things on the screen?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't planning to, but I got it here, and I can do that. Super happy to talk through that. I'm just not sure if it can do a share screen and things like that, but we can run through that and do like a 15-minute. I can do like a half an hour one, and that could be a pretty good way to talk through it. Sure.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to visualize, and then we can unpack, try to do that, a light version of that, and then unpack it with questions and dialogue. Now, did Sini do anything to be able to present us?
Yep. So right down in the middle of your screen, when you're on the StreamYard page, you'll see the present. Yeah. And then all you have to do is
slides from your computer. Let's try this. Okay, awesome. So it says it wants to upload. Just bear with me 1 sec, sorry.
And if you have any difficulty with it, we can move on and just do dialogue.
No, I definitely think it's probably going to help, definitely.
So Corey, while he's doing that, so what they're doing is taking clinical trials and tokenizing it into NFTs.
Well, so to not to take away from Savva here, but what they're doing is there is a huge issue with unmonopolizable therapies. So think a drug that goes off patent, for instance, or something that was never on patent that's been shown to actually, let's say there's a certain type, let's just say all of a sudden aspirin can help with cancer. And all of a sudden you go, wait a second, that's great. Well, no pharmaceutical company is going to pick it up. No doctor is going to pick it up. And the reason being is because it costs millions of dollars to get an FDA approval. So the pharmaceutical companies aren't going to spend 30, 40, $50 million getting it through clinicals and then marketing it and selling it whenever somebody else can just go and sell it for pennies on the dollar. And a doctor, because of legal reasons, is not going to sell it because the fact that then they could be held because it's not FDA approved. So you've got this huge, basically, issue that is all about the economics and incentives being misaligned with what's best for humanity. And that's what Web3 and crypto comes in, is because we are getting to re-pull on the levers of what's actually best for us as human beings and recreate systems as we can best see fit.
Okay.
Now the NFTs come in because of creating a community and fundraising and around some beautiful art. But I won't go too much further into it just right now because I'm sure Savva's going to cover some of that.
Yeah, no, I'm totally happy to just talk through that. And obviously questions are great, but this, I'll just run through this, and if you like, yeah, I'll try and run through it. It usually takes about 20 minutes to half an hour. But yeah, just feel free to stop me anytime and ask questions. Other than that, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, and Savva, I'll try to politely interject to just ask the questions I think other people might be thinking.
Sure. Okay. And then yeah, we can also show you some of the NFT art, which I think is going to be super cool. So yeah, basically we're talking about impact markets. So impact markets are what Corey was talking about with. It's an idea around Web3 at the moment. There's this idea that's called a retroactive public goods funding, and the issue is there are some things called public goods, which are essentially, there's no way of stopping other people from using a public good. They're called non-rivalrous. So in other words, if somebody uses a public good, a great example of public good is just information or open source software. So if we publish some open source software, then everyone can use it. You can't stop other people from using it. And it's also, yeah, non-excludable. That's right, where you can't stop other people from using it. So in the context of medicines, if we could tell you like that, ivermectin could treat COVID, or like fluvoxamine actually is the one that people should be thinking about. Fluvoxamine could treat COVID, then there's no way that I can stop other people just buying fluvoxamine online, because it's a cheap drug. You can just buy it from your pharmacy. You can get your doctor to prescribe it, for like $10. And even if I've got a patent on that information is basically what's valuable. So the idea is with impact markets is you create a market for generating this kind of information or these kinds of things, which are called public goods. And you can do that through crypto, through these, basically by collecting what we call retroactive funding. So getting a source of people that basically put money in. And for us, that's through the issue of these NFTs. These NFTs will represent pre-purchased clinical trial data, say for a public good medicine. And that's the market basically figures out how much they want to deliver that clinical trial data. And we have mechanisms for basically valuing the data in an optimal way. And we can go through that. So yeah, as we were saying before, there's this massive healthcare crisis. It's like 20% of GDP is spent on healthcare. Sure, it's just very, very expensive, particularly in the US. And there's also the ability to buy new drugs or to sort of create new drugs is super expensive, because it costs over $1 billion. That's kind of the word that's being thrown around to make a new drug, because particularly you've got to pay for all of the failed clinical trials, and it might take 10 to 15 years to make a new drug, because you've got to start from scratch with a new chemical that's patented. And so there's also this thing called a patent cliff. Basically, as soon as your drug runs out of a patent, the price just drops, because it means everyone can just make this drug. And typically they make them in China and India, especially India and Israel as well with Teva. And then basically usually what happens is that's, if things are working right in the US, it's a little bit of a problem that a lot of the generic drugs actually stay really expensive, because there's these kind of barriers to market and things. And that's why Mark Cuban's doing that cost plus drugs company as well, which is trying to basically buy things directly from India and stuff like that. But ideally, yeah, the drugs themselves should be super cheap because they're just an industrial chemical. And once you can make that chemical, because the patents run out, it should be really cheap to buy those drugs. But the problem is that creates a problem that once the patent runs out, there's no more private incentives to find new uses. And then the problem with the patent system is that pharmaceutical companies are just chasing patented drugs. And, because they can charge billions and billions of dollars for these drugs because no one else can make them. And what happens is that then pharma companies end up putting patents before patients. So they'll create the most patented version of a drug. So if you think of the Gillette razor, the one that got taken to market was not the best razor. It was actually the one that had 40 or so patents to cover it. And likewise, a lot of the big drugs, the blockbuster drugs, what they call blockbuster drugs that make like over $1 billion a year, they've got like hundreds of patents covering them. Like Humira's got like 200 something patents covering them. So they just chase the most patentable drugs. And then sometimes those are actually harmful. Those are not actually the best drugs because they happen to be new. And that's what happened with patents is that your patent gets granted for a new drug and a non-obvious drug, one that hasn't been published before, but not necessarily the best drug. And this is leading to this kind of thing called a tragedy of the commons, which I talked about before with the public goods. If everyone can benefit from a drug and everyone can make it for cheap, then no one puts the money into to fund the clinical trials. And what that means is that even if you're a researcher and you've come up with this amazing treatment and you've got great clinical trial results, maybe in mice typically in mice, because you can't afford to put it in humans unless you've got a pharmaceutical company funding you, then a drug company will just say, no, we're not going to fund that. And also technology transfer officers at your university, they'll quietly screen these drugs and they'll just stay on the bench. So there could be literally sort of thousands of treatments and cures for diseases that are just not funded. And, the public never finds out about this because these drugs just don't get funded. There's no money that goes to these drugs. So you never find out if they would be the treatment for your disease. And so that's because there's these missing incentives under the patent system. Essentially, pharmaceutical companies will never fund large phase 2 and 3 clinical trials for off-patent therapies because they can't enforce a monopoly price. So these safe, low-cost, and effective treatments are being ignored. And there's this hierarchy of evidence. So doctors and the FDA rely on these large randomized controlled trials to support their decisions. So that if no one's there to pay for these large randomized controlled trials, like say for ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, they'll only pay for like little trials. And then everyone just argues over the evidence of these little trials and no one actually funds a really big clinical trial so we can definitively prove does this thing work or not. Then, often there are sort of arguments. And I realize hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are like sort of politically charged, but it just happens with that sort of problem with public funding kind of happens through like a lot of off-patent drugs as they typically don't enter the mainstream. And that's sort of saying there's this market failure. And the ironic thing is that if a repurposed drug, if you've got an old drug like fluvoxamine or whatever, and could show that it treated COVID, it actually costs a lot less than a new drug. You're not talking about billions and billions of dollars in 10 to 15 years. You might be talking sort of 30 to 50 million, that sort of thing, and maybe less than 3 years. And so this was the main core of the issue is that 90% of the drugs out there that actually your doctor prescribes are off-patent or generic drugs. So there's this huge substrate of drugs that we're just not tapping into. You can patent a method of use. So you could patent, say, the method of using fluvoxamine to treat COVID, or we'll talk about ketamine to treat depression, off-patent ketamine. But if you can't enforce that patent, if you can't basically sue individual doctors and patients, you're never going to be able to raise money to do the big clinical trials. So essentially new uses for off-patent drugs are these things called public goods, non-rivalrous, because you can't, if somebody buys ketamine or fluvoxamine, takes it off label, you can't, it doesn't stop you from doing that. And non-excludable, you can't stop anyone from doing it. These are public goods. And there's also massive business opportunity, business case, because the cost saving for generics, however, the business case is basically for health insurers if they want to save money. and governments as well. There's like trillions of dollars. So over the last 10 years, $2.2 trillion. Sorry, there's a typo there. But, about over $300 billion a year generics save the US healthcare system. So there's massive cost savings, but no way under the current patent system to capture those cost savings. And so, as I was saying, it's a big opportunity. It's actually around 7,500 generics and 50,000 nutraceuticals, like things like supplements and plant medicines, medicinal mushrooms, things like that, that could be medicinal and useful treatments, but and they're vastly outnumber the number of patented drugs, but nobody is trying to capture this massive market and innovation.
Hey, Savva.
Yeah.
On that last slide, because I thought this the last time I saw that you go through this with protocol, it kind of hit me, and I have a question for you. I noticed that in the previous graph, probably 6-7 slides back, it talks about the compounding cost. You don't have to go back to it, but the compounding cost of bringing a drug to market. Is it possibly because there's a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pool of chemicals that we know about, and then therefore we have to essentially create the most patentable drug? So in order for us to create the most patentable drug, it's kind of like that that addict who needs a fix. It takes more and more and more and more and more to get that fix. Yeah, that chart right there.
I mean, it's exactly that. We're running out of buttons we can push on the human body without killing us. Like, that's what I believe. I know with mRNA and biologics and things, we're probably, basically that's like proteins, but definitely with small molecule drugs, there's probably only so many patentable things we can patent. So we are definitely running into a smaller, and it's like a mine that you've been mining for sort of 50 years or whatever, and you're not getting as much gold out of it, and you just keep mining the same mine, and instead there's all this gold around you, but there's no money to be made because you can't fence off that mine. You can't stop other people from mining that particular area. So that's what creates this tragedy of the commons. But yeah, definitely diminishing returns. I think that's a valid statement behind why the drugs are getting more expensive. And actually, they're not that effective. So many, about 2/3 of drugs that get taken to market are found to be not that effective versus any other existing drugs out there. And yet they get charged out for hundreds of billions of, hundreds of billions of dollars a year for monopoly profits. So massive sort of big inefficiency going on with the current system.
Well, so to my thoughts, and then I'll move on here. My thoughts is it would be actually really interesting to see, almost kind of like total world oil reserves. I bet you if you played with the numbers, you could actually see compounding difficulty and also decreasing outcome, and quantify exactly how many years of patented innovation are left in the medical field. Like, you might be able to almost be like, here's the oil reserves, here's the amount of, we've got 14.3 years, and it's kind of like Bitcoin, the difficulty of mining it goes up by this much over each period. So you can almost map out the depth of the medical patent cliff, like in the depth of medical patents, and also the increasing costs. And I think perhaps that might be something that can be forecasted to governments, be like, hey, look, it's not just a current problem, let's compound this and show the trajectory. Because to your point, I can't wrap my head around how it's possible to go through all these drugs and they fall off patent, and then to have to create something that's not only, because anybody who's gone through the patent process knows you can't just do something that's very similar but new. It's got to be like so far off that it has to be defensible. And to your point, you got to have 200 patents on it in order to defend it in court or whatever it might be. And so at some point in time, that's going to have to break. It's clear, it's evident. The question is just like, over what time? Do we have 4 years? Do we have 14? Do we have 20? And what's it going to cost by the time we hit that? Does that make sense?
I think that's the whole thing behind eRoom's law. It's just we are in a state, and it's getting harder and harder for drug companies to make new drugs. They're pricing them at higher and higher costs to make their money back, and healthcare costs are basically end up increasing exponentially. I think that's the whole idea behind this eRoom's law, is that eventually we are going to hit a kind of ceiling. At least we need new business models. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to kind of compare, what it would be like if we had a different business model, because we haven't had one yet. But I think it's definitely, it's quite apparent that it's unsustainable, or at least there are much more sustainable business models out there. But yeah, I'm happy to riff on that a bit, or just I'll go through some examples just so that people kind of makes it a bit more real. I mean, these off-patent drugs are not like, it's these things. There are a lot of examples of patent drugs. Now, I don't know. I'm not endorsing any of these things as treatments because they haven't gone through FDA approval and things like that. But these are just examples to show that there are lots and lots of examples out there of patent drugs that could be potentially useful treatments for many diseases, but we just don't have the funding to fund them. So there's this one called oxyphenylbutazone to treat drug-resistant tuberculosis, basically an NSAID like ibuprofen. And the researchers are saying no drug firm will pay for clinical trials. They don't expect to make a profit. And that'll be the case for an off-patent drug people can buy over the counter. So, people say this, right? And what if this was a treatment? Low-dose naltrexone to treat chronic pain. Again, no, it's off patent. So, and there's a lot of, this was actually for Crohn's disease. It was some evidence that it could be useful for Crohn's. Clomipramine to treat brain tumors. It's an antidepressant. Again, according to one of the researchers saying, because the drug is off patent, they need to basically find charitable funding for it. And that's just not a scalable model. Simvastatin, which is a kind of statin for treating MS. It could be useful treatment for MS. Tetrathiomolybdate to prevent recurrence of breast cancer. There's other drugs out there, and this whole idea of preventative medicine, that's another area which is not profitable under the current patent system, because essentially patents, a pharma company is incentivized to basically prescribe as much possible to treat your disease, so they're not incentivized to come up with cures or preventative medicine or prevent recurrence. So with another model like a prize model, you could actually incentivize people to do this sort of thing, because you're paying for the clinical trial data based on how much health impact or quality adjusted life years it adds, instead of just the sales of the drugs. This is called delinkage. BCG vaccine could be useful to type 1 diabetes and balance blood sugar levels. Also, there's Open Source Pharma Foundation is working on looking at BCG vaccine as a treatment for respiratory illnesses in general. So it could be used as like a universal vaccine. BCG vaccine is like one of the first vaccines made for tuberculosis. You might notice sort of people in Eastern Bloc countries, they often have these scars on their arms. It's because of the BCG vaccine. But you can repurpose it. You can maybe put it somewhere on your leg or something where it's not so aesthetically a bit better. But it's been shown to boost innate immunity. There's a lot of studies out there also in Nature, even published in Nature, which is one of the top journals, around how BCG might boost innate immunity. And this could reduce incidence of, say, COVID and future pandemics by up to 80%. But again, cents in the dollar, super cheap. So no private incentives to fund this sort of research. Dichloroacetate, this kind of did the rounds. You guys might have even heard of this. Maybe 10 years ago, people were buying this online. The FDA came down on them pretty hard, but it was seen as could be potentially an anti-cancer drug particularly for neuroblastoma, for brain cancer. IV vitamin C, that's one that has been seen as quack medicine, but recently actually it's more, there's a lot of real science behind it. Basically, if you do an IV intravenous dose of high dose vitamin C, it could be a very effective treatment for cancer. Again, I'm not endorsing this. This is just some science, but we need clinical trials to really get this to prove whether this works or not. But so researcher Muegge Rd is in my hometown in Christchurch, New Zealand. She's one of the leading experts on this. One of the richest people in New Zealand, he got pancreatic cancer. We know him through a family friend, and this was the last thing he took. So people that are super high net worth, they're also dying, and they're taking patented drugs, and they're also trying these new drugs. And ironically, he would have paid $100 million or whatever if this drug actually worked. So there's a real business case to doing research around this. Unfortunately, it just doesn't. There's no way to capture that innovation under the patent system. As I mentioned as well, fluvoxamine for treating COVID-19, it's an SSRI for anti-anxiety. It's shown actually in Brazilian clinical trials that reduced COVID related deaths by 90% and hospitalizations by up to 50 or about 30% actually. But that's on par with this other drug called molnupiravir by Merck, which is a patented drug, which the US government through BARDA, actually US Army paid $1.2 billion to stockpile this. That was $700 a course versus this drug, which is $10 a course. So massive cost difference. Also, UK NHS stockpiled bought $1.5 billion worth of this drug. So they're buying this massive, expensive drug, which is basically has similar efficacy to this off-patent drug, according to ICER, which is an international agency that does these comparative trials and says that basically fluvoxamine is more effective, more cost-effective rather, but it might have similar efficacy to molnupiravir. Unfortunately, no private incentives to do these clinical trials. And now with Paxlovid, actually, it's a little bit. Paxlovid is a much better drug, reduces hospitalizations by like 90%. However, there's some rebound effects on that. That's Pfizer's therapeutic. But it's definitely a role for fluvoxamine, I think, for future pandemics or COVID. So, this is an obvious one. Cannabis, it's, you can't enforce a monopoly price. You can't stop people selling cannabis. Everyone can grow it. But it could reduce chronic pain. It could address this opiate crisis, which is costing killing millions and millions of people and costing maybe over $1 trillion a year for the US and Canada. Cannabis could get people off opiates. It could be, but not much private incentive to research cannabis flower. There is, Marinol, which is used to treat cancer. I believe epilepsy as well. It's used off-label to treat chronic pain, but no private incentives to do the big clinical trials. Psilocybin, same sort of thing. You can patent. So Compass Pathways patented a crystallized version of psilocybin, but if it's no more effective than the truffles, I think that's going to be, someone's going to do a head-to-head study, and we're going to talk about that later. In fact, we're going to talk about it now. So ketamine for treatment of major depression. So ketamine is very effective treatment for major depression. It's unfortunately though, it's $2 a dose, and say $12 for a course of 6 infusions, whereas esketamine is like $12,000 a course, or 6 to 10 or more, and about $850 a dose. And all esketamine is just a left-handed version of ketamine. That's what pharma companies will do. They'll just patent a tweaked version of the molecule, so they'll chase the most patentable version of the molecule. In fact, but the systematic reviews, which is basically a combination of clinical trials, randomized controlled trials, suggest that actually generic ketamine is best in class. It's actually the most effective treatment. But again, this massive market failure, and this could save literally billions of dollars to like Medicaid, Medicare, CMS, Veterans Affairs. They could save billions of dollars by not having to pay for the expensive ketamine. If they just, if there was a way to switch to the cheaper ketamine. And I can talk about this a little bit, actually, around just this idea of this new, well, it's not that new, but it's something called interventional pharmacoeconomics. Actually, if we can get the VA, Veterans Affairs, on board and just and say, hey, we like to save money, we enjoy saving billions of dollars, and we don't want to take any risk of clinical trials, we can design a clinical trial that basically saves them money in real time. And if you think about like the cost difference between these two things, one of them is $12,000 a course, it might be $20,000 a year, let's say, to keep people on esketamine. And the other one might be, say, $50 or something like that a year. So that's ketamine. Because of this $20,000 cost difference, you can actually put half of the people, you can do a clinical trial. What happens with clinical trials is you randomize it, and people don't know what they're getting. Are they getting ketamine? Are they getting esketamine? And they're happy to do that because ketamine might be cheaper and safer drug. They don't necessarily, you as a patient, do you want to get better? Or do you want the latest patentable drug? You don't care, right? And doctors don't care, and patients shouldn't care. They just want to get better. And from a health insurance perspective, they shouldn't be like, oh, we want to pay for the most expensive drug. No, we should, ideally, if we're all logical, we should pay for the most effective drug, right? Or the drug that's similar efficacy to a really expensive drug. So they should logically be willing to enter into one of these clinical trials where they save money, because they can put, instead of everyone gets ketamine, normally everyone gets S-ketamine, because that's the only approved one that they'll reimburse for, because it's FDA approved. So they have to pay like $12,000 per patient. Say they've got 10,000 patients, and they're just paying for ketamine all year, and that's costing $100 million a year. Well, why not put half of them on, or $200 million a year or something? If it's $20,000 times 10,000 patients, that's $200 million a year. So instead, you could put half of them on normal ketamine and save $100 million. And with that $100 million savings, you could do this thing. You could agree to basically give those costs, pay for a contract research organization which runs the clinical trial to run that and determine if those things are equivalent, or if ketamine is superior. And then if they determine that it is superior in this massive clinical trial of 10,000 people, now we've got a huge clinical trial, right? No one can ignore this. Now the FDA can't ignore it. And so they can approve FDA-approved ketamine, and they can then, now the health insurers all around the world can reimburse ketamine for depression, and that saves billions and billions of dollars. And it will save that specific health insurer maybe billions of dollars as well, because they're like the VA, and they're having to treat millions of people. So that's the idea behind this, and I've sort of preempted it. But yeah, I'll talk about longevity. Generic drugs we're interested in, and there are certain drugs that can help with longevity. Rapamycin, NMN, you might have heard of these things, resveratrol, vitamin D. If we can get like halve hospitalization costs for, like, we've got an aging baby boom population, and that's just going to completely decimate everybody's healthcare budgets. But imagine if you could take a very cheap off-patent drug like a metformin or rapamycin, and that could reduce hospitalizations and increase healthy lifespan, and without having to go to hospital and having to go into care. That would be also a significant economic advantage. So this is the solution we're talking about. It's pay-for-success contracts. Basically, these contracts that you get a payer, and that's what we're trying to do, is find a source of retroactive funding where they essentially pay for the clinical trial data. They will pay you for proving that these off-patent drugs work. Instead of paying for the drugs themselves, which are super cheap, you pay for the data, which proves which treatment protocol using these off-patent drugs is safe and effective. And that creates a market for an investor, this impact market for an investor to go and fund the clinical trials needed to repurpose the generic drug. Now the researcher can pay for these clinical trials, and then if there's success, it'll release these outcome payments that are proportional to how well those clinical trials do versus the expensive patented drug or usual care. And there's a lot of advantages versus the current system, which is basically charities and governments like directly funding clinical trials. Those charities and governments don't want to pay for large phase 3 clinical trials. They're not going to pay for a $100 million clinical trial. It's too risky, and they're just, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. If the clinical trial fails, it'll be all over the newspapers. Oh, they wasted $100 million on this clinical trial, and it wasn't even that effective. This could have been spent on hospital beds. So there's massive political issues. If a private company goes and does it, nobody cares. Probably won't even make the papers. Okay, so same technology. Pharma industry has better technology. They can use like AI. They can screen hundreds of these off-patent drugs, thousands of them, millions of them. Thousands of them, and tens of thousands of nutraceuticals to figure out which ones might be effective. Free market's also a lot more efficient, versus centralization where you've got grant funding. Usually the grant funders will fund like people that they're familiar with, basically like their friends, and there's a big risk of like corruption around that. And also, like, if you're a bit of a maverick, no one really likes you because you're coming up with a new amazing idea. Typically a grant, you might struggle to get a grant because it's your peers who are controlling the purse strings. And also, as I was saying, like before, like repurposing generic drugs off patent drugs, it's a lot cheaper to do these clinical trials because they're usually been proven as safe. We've used ketamine for like 50 years, ever since the Vietnam War. We know what the doses are, and typically those things are more safe, so that's a lot cheaper. You can skip a lot of the early stage phase 1 and even phase 2 clinical trials. Sometimes go direct to phase 3. So could outcompete patented drugs basically for health insurers. They should want to pay for the cheaper, better drug.
So, Savva, to jump into that for a second. So, one of the things that I've noticed, because I've been always trying to unpack, why does the system work the way that it does? And of course, you can typically break it down to what are the incentive structures, who stands to benefit and why. And then whatever those incentive structures are tends to create the outcomes by and large. And charities are one of the ones that have always thrown me for a loop until I dug deeper into them. It's like, well, why wouldn't a charity take this on? And then I started looking back a little bit. I go, okay, charity, their incentive is raise money, right? Of course. How do they do that? Well, they do that by almost kind of having shareholders, the donators, that they need to constantly be in front of them and say, hey, look, this is what we did with your money today. Here's what we did with your money last week. Here's what we did with your money last month. And so charities keep on going to the lowest common denominator, all the short-term kind of fixed solutions where they can go, oh, look, we did a hospital bed, or, oh, we administered these drugs to these people, or, oh, we uplifted this one village here. And they're not solving any of the systemic problems because it's too long-term to try to keep people along for the ride for. And so it's kind of creates this incentive structure misalignment again, even on the charitable side of things, because a lot of people are like, oh, well, that sounds like a public benefit, public good. Why not charities? Well, the problem is, by and large, I don't see any charities looking 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. It's because of us. It's all because of us. And that's why I think that something like this, and also just Web3, where we can kind of look at things longer term, I kind of feel like that's kind of flipping the paradigm a bit. So, because that always shook me a little bit, was the whole charity. Why not charity? The other stuff, it makes sense. Does that make sense, Savva?
Yeah, no, super correct. I mean, a lot of them, a lot of these people in the charities, they're also getting paid, and they want to show results to their funders, and definitely going for more window dressing type things. Although some of them do really good work, but particularly in the medical pharmaceutical space, I think what it is they just give up because they're like, well, we don't have $100 million, right? And then you've got like Gates Foundation and things like that. And they're more focused maybe on other things, or maybe they're more centralized. But there are actually big charities. Okay, so I'm probably going to get into some controversial areas, but I think this is, if you look at the facts here, this is actually not that. This is known. So most of the big cancer charities, the big charities that should be doing this stuff, 50% of their funding comes from pharmaceutical companies. You might not know this. A lot of them are like that. And what these charities do is they actually act like the marketing arm for the pharmaceutical companies. There's this incentive misalignment then. What tends to happen is there's this kind of game between the pharmaceutical companies and the payers, so governments and health insurers. Pharmaceutical companies come up with this new drug, they price it at this outrageous price. And typically what payers want to do is they have these mechanisms to determine if a drug is cost effective. One of these mechanisms is not really used so much in the States, but more overseas, particularly in the UK, is called a quality adjusted life year. And what they do is they say, we're willing to pay you $50,000 per year of healthy life that your drug can add. And that's fair because it assumes that you, as the payer, the NHS, whoever it is, the health insurer, the US government, has limited funds. So it makes sense for them to say, we've got to cap the amount we're willing to pay per year of healthy life, assuming every person's life is equal, and I think that's fair. Then we should be, that should be the cap that we pay. Now, of course, with end of year life, or some vulnerable populations, they go above that certain cap. People are more willing to pay for like children, and people at end of life, particularly for end of life cancer treatments. Those might be like $200,000 per quali, because you might only add another 3 or 4 months of life, but that gives you another 3 or 4 months with your loved ones and things like that. People feel like that's cost effective, but typically what happens is these drugs get funded. They're very, very expensive, and then the governments or the health insurers don't want to pay for them. So what the pharma companies do then is they go to and basically engage these patient organizations, and they say, hey, look, we've got this brand new drug, but the government doesn't want to pay for it. And then so these patient groups basically go and write into the papers, and they say, oh, the government doesn't want to pay for these drugs, rather than saying, hey, maybe you can bring your costs down, or maybe you can make more cost-effective drugs. But no, from the patient's perspective, they're like, well, look, we're desperate. We need this new drug, and we just want somebody to pay for it. We can't afford it. Buy the new drug. So there's, I understand where they're coming from as well. It's not completely like, because that's the only thing. I mean, if I'm sick, then I'm going to get a new drug. I'm going to want to get the latest drug. And, if my insurer is not covering it and I've got to pay for it out of pocket, I'm going to be pissed off. So I'm not blaming those patient groups. I think, I understand why they would do that. It's just that's the system that gets played. And unfortunately, a lot of these patient groups then don't, are actually very closely aligned to pharmaceutical companies and this sort of patent model. And obviously, they don't see an alternative as well. Like they're not going to, again, they don't want to take on the risk. Often they can't afford big clinical trials, whereas the pharma companies can. So that's giving maybe a little bit of flavor and to what you're saying as well. So we think that this is a way forward for crypto. You can basically, instead of $3 billion market cap for Bored Ape Yacht Club, how much would the market cap be for a safe and effective open source therapy that treats, your mental illness, your cancer, your, arthritis? And we think this should be the future of NFTs, open source pharma NFTs that basically create an impact market for open source medicine. It should be, in theory, a lot more valuable than these other kind of NFT use cases, which are just primarily art. And we've got some great art as well. And then there is this idea of open source pharma IP NFTs, which are basically the other side of the equation, like who's going to pay for these clinical trials and how are we going to get basically investors to pay for these clinical trials. Now, these ones here probably are not going to be securities, I think, because they're a charitable, although I'm not offering legal advice, get your own advice. But unlikely these things are going to be seen as securities because they're purely charitable. You're buying them as a pre-order of clinical trial data. You're not necessarily buying them to trade. These things here are basically a way to get investors on board to invest in these clinical trials, and in return you get a payout from this medical prize fund, and that's why we want to launch this Medical Impact DAO. Basically, by selling these medical impact NFTs, they go into a prize fund that's paid out every year. 20% is paid out every year. This is for a specific. This can be a general prize fund, and then it gets paid out to specific prize funds that the DAO members or the NFT owners can vote on how we want to allocate, which sort of where we want these prize monies to go. Like, are we interested in COVID? Are we interested in treatment-resistant depression? Are we interested in glioblastoma? Are we interested in Crohn's disease? And then once these prize funds are there, they get paid out a specific amount, say 20% per year. And then these clinical trials are funded then by these things called IP NFTs, which basically represent the clinical trial data and allow researchers to raise money for their clinical trials for a repurposed off-patent drug like ketamine, when before they wouldn't allow that. So then if those clinical trials are successful, they get turned into a Hypercert. The Hypercert has a number of impact points that are basically determined by comparing this Hypercert with usual care, like say their most expensive patented drug. If your clinical trial is 50% better than usual care, or 15% or 0.5%, then you get 50 points or 0.5 points or whatever it is. And there is this basically market mechanism to automatically pay out and come up with an equilibrium. There's this, according to the size of the fund. So this is infinitely scalable. If there was $1 billion in this, then you might get like 100 Hypercerts or 1,000 of them. But if there's like $10 million in this, you might get 3 Hypercerts. And if there's 1 million, maybe you'd only get 1 Hypercert or something like that. So, and then also you get clinical trial failures. You get to know which clinical trials don't work. So you almost get this negative information for free. You don't necessarily have to pay for that. So this is a scalable market for funding these off-patent drugs, these public good medicines. And there's usually an equilibrium that's reached. So if impact investors want 10% return on investment, they'll look at how much money is getting paid out in the prize fund. They'll look at what this clinical trial is, and they'll try and work out like what's the chance of them making money and how much they're going to make. So they'll basically do an NPV calculation. So VCs do this called a net present value. That's how they decide how much they're going to invest. If the amount in the prize fund is not enough for them, you can actually get philanthropy to come in here and basically boost the returns. This is a little bit like what Gitcoin do as well. It's basically like you let the crowd or the private industry or basically the investors create a signal for which clinical trials to fund as a philanthropy. So they don't have to pick the winners; they can just rely on the markets to do that. So it's quite clever as well in that sense that it leverages the markets. And then the idea is that eventually, say this is for a depression, say this is a medical prize fund, open psychedelic, say we're issuing open psychedelic NFTs or open longevity NFTs, and we get to a point where we're pretty certain that there is this optimal treatment protocol for a drug, and through these phase 2 clinical trials, which are like the middle clinical trials, and they usually cost around $1 million to $2 million each to run. But say we're pretty confident that we've got an optimal treatment protocol, we might then file a method of use patent over that treatment protocol to build like a bit of a moat around that. And then the idea is that you have a public good pharma company that then can go to a health insurer and say, hey, we can negotiate these pay-for-success contracts or advanced market commitment. We can say, look, you're going to save $100 million by doing this clinical trial. Pay us those cost savings. We will do the clinical trial for you, and then agree to pay us a percentage of your future cost savings, which we can say, an advanced market commitment, like you will agree to buy our version of ketamine, our open ketamine, or our version of fluvoxamine, and you save like billions of dollars, so you're happy, and then we also get a market for our version, and that builds this business model around doing these kinds of public good medicines. So that's kind of that's the one, but I can also just show you some of these NFTs as well.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Show some of the art.
Okay, so let's try and stop sharing.
Do you want us to take off the screen share while you're doing it? Yeah. Don't want to know what else you have on your computer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an open book, but yeah, it might be some weird stuff. Who knows? So should try and share screen. Let's try this again. Here we go. Awesome. So yeah, I mean, we've teamed up with a gentleman, Michael Pierre Price, who's an algorithm artist. He's an ex-physicist. He used to design Dungeons and Dragons games like back in the 80s. Super cool guy. His wife also is a psychologist, works with veterans. And so he's very aligned. He's used this tool called Midjourney to create these amazing art pieces that we're going to, with the prompt of psychedelics as medicine. So, each of these is unique. I mean, if this was like a year ago, I think we would have paid millions of dollars to get an artist to like produce these. I mean, this is like a ketamine molecule or psilocybin. A lot of these, like you can see here. I mean, people would put these on their walls, and I think these are inherently valuable as art. There's some. So we've got 1,001 pieces, unique pieces. We're going to do a free NFT drop, basically to get a whitelist, 1,001 of them to get a whitelist into the Discord server. And then, we think these, and what these NFTs represent, though, is an off-patent clinical trial data that is successfully shows that an off-patent drug like ketamine is a successful treatment, successfully treats depression. So anyone that buys these NFTs, they know that their clinical trial, that their funds are going towards successful clinical trial data, which I think is quite compelling versus just donating to a charity, not knowing where your money is going. So yeah, you guys get the world's first public, I guess, peak, but we should get this should allow the gating. But yeah, suffice to say, some of these are super cool. There is one that we're really interested in. There's one that's a door, and we want to use that one for the so these are all some themes there, but there's some great.
Yeah, I think every single one of these that he did is just absolutely gorgeous. There's a handful of them that really stand out too. I mean, they all stand out. But there's a couple that I'm just absolutely enamored with personally.
Ones that look like nebula.
Oh yeah.
Space themed.
Yeah, there's I like the ones that look like the kind of inside the glass jars. There's also kind of like a kind of person standing, kind of like the raincoat stuff. Yeah, that's
These are all kind of DNA. I mean, some of these, yeah.
Yeah, like would you rather have that or a monkey? I mean,
Well, objectively, you know, I mean, I realize, but that's the thing. You've got to sort of build a market, and I'm not knocking Bored Ape Yacht Club for what they've done. It's not just monkeys. Yeah. There's gating. There's parties that they do, but you know, personally, I like this kind of art. I really like surreal art. I really like Dali, and this more like kind of classic. You know, I mean, particularly what Midjourney's done. I mean, just such an amazing tool, and then use in the hands of like a real algorithmic artist who knows kind of how to curate these things. He's done an amazing job. Like, just yeah, any one of these, I'd be happy to like. I'd be pretty happy to put it on my wall or whatever.
Yeah. So, Savva, while we're on this topic, if someone wanted to be a part of the drop, is that possible? You said to join a Discord server.
Yeah, so we want to do like an early NFT drop, and these are the ones I was talking about. Like these ones with the eye will have a number of NFTs that basically will be part of the early drop. There is this one with a door that I want to show you guys that will basically provide like a gated access to the Discord server where people will be whitelisted and get early access to these NFTs. So yeah, we want to do 1,001 of them, and the plan is hopefully in the next month or so to launch. We're working with Fair XYZ, but we're also talking to a number of other people. Fair XYZ did the Ukraine NFT launch and raised over $1 million for that. That was with the Ukraine government.
Yeah, their platform has really turned out quite beautifully.
Yeah, they've got quite good sort of rails, but we want to talk to other people as well. And there is another organization called Doing Good, which basically does charitable NFTs. So you notice some of these. I think you really went for it on this one. I mean, some of these are just, this is like first time actually I've gone through them properly. So it's just really, I mean, this is, it's really
yeah, wow.
I want to try and find these doors. Yeah, there we go. Now we've got the doors, and I think those will be quite good for particularly this one. And it's like a free NFT basically. And then you can get that to then go through the door into the so creating. Yeah, we've got a number of people, and we'll try and create a bit of vibes and experience around this. But that's that.
Which seems really suitable for a gating mechanism, because for those who are less familiar with NFTs, they can kind of work like a key. If you have them, you can get into, let's say, a Discord or into a community. If you don't, you can't. But to take and actually have a door as your key NFT is, I think, quite cool.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, you know, NFTs and potentially I think we might have some governance aspects to it, like around, you know, maybe more of a general NFT, but we'll think about enabling that for, you know, people that own particular NFTs. They might be able to vote on certain things related to the DAO and where the direction that it goes. We need to be a little bit careful about that because of securities laws and things like that. I do kind of want to keep these NFTs as more charitable and also just a bit more like Bored Ape Yacht Club. Maybe you can make your own merchandise and stuff like that with them. but yeah, but we are definitely looking at different utilities for these NFTs.
Very cool. Well, Savva, it looks like we're already coming up with a few seconds from the hour mark here. Absolutely brilliant. Of course, as you know, love this project very much. I'll make sure that we kind of push this out to people who didn't get a chance to be here to watch the video. That said, next steps, kind of to Jonas's question. So next steps, if you were watching this video in the future here, or now for that matter, and you want to go, you know what, I want to be a part of this, where would they go? What would they do?
Yeah, we'll definitely go onto our website, crowdfundedcures.org. So crowdfunded, FUNDED, cures, CURES.org. And we've got a Discord server. It's on the bottom right. And sign up to our mailing list. Emails, I think, is probably the best, easiest way. If you scroll down the site, you should get a prompt to sign up. But otherwise, yeah, an easy one is just come onto the Discord, say hello, and we will add you to the list for the NFT, the free mint.
Nice, awesome. So absolutely brilliant. So happy you could join us. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we part?
No, just, yeah, thanks for having me on, and super cool. Yeah, I think it's, from my perspective, we kind of need all the help we can get. So if anyone kind of knows or has contacts to people that have contacts with health insurers, or people in the VA, CMS, or Kaiser, or whoever your insurer is, we kind of want people to talk about it. If you've got any contacts with media, I'm happy to talk to anybody, basically. And yeah, we just want to get the word out. And we think that this is a really high impact use case for crypto generally. Like, it's got a chance to kind of do what crypto said it was going to do, which is create this kind of regenerative economic model that just has this positive feedback loop for everybody. And with something like repurposing generic drugs, it's so much cheaper, and often, as I've shown, it can be even the clinical trials just pay for themselves. We just kind of have to get like a big health insurer on board. So a lot of that, I think, the reason to reach out to the community, and particularly start with psychedelics, where there's a lot of overlap with the crypto community, is to, I think, to get some community around it, and to basically get engaged, and to, act like, with this medical impact act, like a little bit like what charities do, and start lobbying to health insurers to basically enter these pay-for-success contracts, where they don't, they're not taking on any risk, and they're basically potentially saving billions of dollars. And more importantly, patients get access to drugs that more patients get access to these life-saving drugs and therapies.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Hey, Jonas, you want to close this out?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Savva, thanks again for joining us, and really, really interesting stuff. So to anyone who's here and also watching online, or didn't get to make this but is watching it later, this is actually going to be the last Crypto Over Coffee that we do for the next couple of months while we get really intensive with Crypto World. We're going to be working to raise some pretty serious funding so that we can really ramp up everything that we're doing here to a really serious level. So we're still going to have some other events going on. We've got our Patreon exclusive events. If anybody wants to kind of support what we're doing here with the free education and bringing people to the Web3 projects like this, you guys can join our Patreon and become a part of that event. We'll likely still be having our Bitcoin over beer, but as always, just keep an eye on your email. If you haven't joined our mailing list, you can do that on our website, and that'll keep you up to date on everything that we do have going on. But yeah, again, I think that's pretty much it. Savva, thank you so much for the information.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Crypto World. Hope you guys, become the next Walmart, whatever. But yeah, no, that's awesome. And thanks again for giving me a chance to get the word out of it.
Absolutely. All right, we'll have to have you back again for an update.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, cheers. All right, see you guys.
Cheers.